Good morning. So good to be with you all today. I'm Rudy Jombar, the Associate Dean of the Criminal Justice Program here at Broward College. Welcome to one of our IPS colloquiums. This is a program that we have launched about over a year ago, and we have had just phenomenal guest speakers, as of course is the case for today. So really good to be with you all. The mission of IPS Colloquium is to expose our students and our community, but we're also collaborative with our entire Broward College community to practitioners in the field of criminal justice. The idea is to really expound upon our students the need for professionalism, leadership, and professional etiquette. And so with that being the case, it would be, of course, our unbelievable honor to have a guest speaker as we do today of whose stature that we have today. Before I introduce our phenomenal guest speaker, I do want to recognize a few people. I want to recognize Wayne Boulier, who serves as the interim dean of the Institute of Public Safety. So good to have you with us. Thank you so much. I want to say thank you to Professor Stephen Muffler, who also serves as Assistant General Counsel to the Broward Sheriff's Office. And of course, just thank you for helping make this happen. We're ecstatic about that. Of course, Chantel Reed, the Executive Assistant to Sheriff Tony. And so we are grateful for her as well. This is a collaborative effort between the Institute of Public Safety as well as ACADI, which is the Advisory Council for the Advancement of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which I'm proud to chair, right? Broward College is definitely mindful of the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so therefore, Sheriff Tony has done a phenomenal job when it comes to that and so many other things for the Broward Sheriff's Office. I want to acknowledge Associate Dean Todd Bernhardt, who's a part of CADI as well, leading out our cultural competence group. My friend, Professor Nilo Marin, or not professor, rather, Associate Dean Nilo Marin. Good to see you, sir, and so many others that I see. I also want to give a big shout out to Dr. Julie Muir and her class, who is watching. It may only say Dr. Mira, but there's so many students. So shout out to you all for being here. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Broward County Sheriff, the leader of the Broward Sheriff's Office, really the chief CEO, if you will, of law enforcement of Broward County. That is Sherriff Gregory Tony. Since taking command of the Broward Sheriff's Office, Sherriff Gregory Tony's dynamic leadership has transformed BSO into one of the most accountable, progressive, and respected public safety agencies in Florida. As Broward County's 17th sheriff and the first African-American to serve in this capacity, Sheriff Tony brings a wealth of experience, unique skill set, and passion for public safety to BSO. Guided by his North Star belief that service equals reward, Sheriff Tony has led efforts to revamp BSO and restore trust in the agency by implementing a host of initiatives focused on bolstering training, building stronger community relations, providing our youth with expanded opportunities for success, and ensuring our employees are held to the highest standards of professionalism and accountability. Growing up in inner city Philadelphia, Sheriff Tony learned from an early age the determination and selflessness that is needed to be an executive police officer. He experienced firsthand the prejudices that exist between minority youth and law enforcement and the difference that must be made in order to change the negative perceptions. As sheriff, he has used his experiences as a launching pad to implement forward-thinking policies to better connect with the many diverse communities BSO serves. Sheriff Tony established his home in the Sunshine State when he moved to Florida to play football at Florida State University under the leadership of legendary coach Bobby Bowden. He graduated from FSU with a degree in criminology and later received a master's degree in criminal justice from Nova Southeastern University. As an adjunct professor for the past 8 years, Sheriff Tony understands the importance of mentoring the next generations that are interested in criminal justice. Sheriff Tony began his law enforcement career in 2005 with the Coral Springs Police Department, where he served on the SWAT team and rose to the rank of sergeant. He also worked in narcotics investigation, burglary apprehension, street intelligence, and field force. While with the CSPD, he received numerous awards, commendations, and honors. Later, too aware of the numerous active shooter and mass bombing tragedies occurring throughout the country and around the world, Sheriff Tony focused on running his security firm, specializing in precise training and providing threat assessments for both public and private sector entities. The training platform developed is currently being used by thousands of people across the world. Since he assumed leadership of BSO in January 2019, Sheriff Tony has been unafraid to tackle controversial matters that can, at times, put him at odds with other law enforcement officials and politicians. Doing what is right, not what is convenient, is his driving force. His priorities include accountability, community policing, diversity, school safety, training and preparedness, and because of his love for our youth, investing in our future. Sheriff Tony will continue to bring the same tireless work ethic that has been characteristic of his career to ensure BSO remains the finest public safety agency in South Florida. And so, Sheriff Tony, without further ado, it is my honor to cede the floor to you. And so you'll speak to us, and if time permits, there'll be a brief question and answer period. Thank you so much, Sheriff Tony.
Absolutely. Good morning, Rudy. Thank you so much for the warm introduction. It's a good opportunity for me to be able to touch students once again. I want to say really quickly hello to my partner, Wayne, who does an outstanding job. Haven't seen you in a while, partner, at the Academy for us. I'm not sure if Linda Wood is on, but as well, another shout out to two colleagues that really help us move our agency forward on a consistent basis. I think it's probably best suited to start with a little bit more highlighted about how I ended up arriving here. And I think it's going to make sense to our student base here and our faculty or staff members who are in attendance about why I lead in the capacity or in the shape or style in which I do. Because I think the background, the story is always important about the man, about how you got here. You know, people see you as the sheriff, and they all understand that throughout that process, there has been quite the journey, a lot of complications, a lot of challenges, but yet I'm here. As you mentioned, Rudy, I grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania during the 1990s. This was a time where the crack epidemic had saturated the entire community. My neighborhood looked like a third world country. Violence had consumed the entire area, and poverty was off the charts. And to come with that, we averaged about 500 homicides per year. And early on in my life, from the age of 12 years old, I had seen what it looks like to see people gunned down and shot and killed in front of me. 14, I had a home invasion where an armed suspect tried to kill me and my brother. I had to shoot and kill him. At 16, as a student athlete coming back from practice, a good friend of mine was shot in the head and killed. And so these type of violence and traumatic experiences had begun to shape me early on. I figured statistically, everything that I heard about the young Black men or Hispanic men in my community was that we were going to go to jail or we were going to end up in the morgue. And that didn't make any sense to me. I felt like there was something else that I could be doing with my life, and that the limitation to two really egregious options was what was on the surface for me. And so as you mentioned, I ended up playing at Florida State, but that journey required me to work in the barbershop, sweep up in the barbershop, work at Sports Authority, drill holes in bowling balls. And that afforded me enough money to put a down payment on an apartment I had never seen in Tallahassee. It afforded me enough money to pay for my first plane ticket. I had never been on a plane. And then with a backpack and a duffel bag and $500 in my pocket, I left Philadelphia and arrived in Tallahassee. Put forth a great amount of work ethic, became a starting player, played a national championship, won the ACC, later offered a scholarship by Bobby Bowden. But throughout that journey of athletics, I had always knew my path was going to be in law enforcement. Throughout all the experiences in Philadelphia that I had, there were a lot of positives in that my aunt and uncle were police officers. I had grew up and seeing what that looks like and how they engage with the community. I had several different leaders, local patrolmen who was constantly engaging with me, telling me, hey, you can do more, son, you're talented. Don't get caught up in the streets. And so all these things had helped shape my career in these individuals. And of course, I navigated over into the police academy, had a great deal of success there, was the recipient of this Sergeant Dell Green Award named after one of the highly decorated officers in Tallahassee who lost his life. And that began to shape me. I said, okay, I know I have some form of leadership capabilities because I'm being presented with all these different things. Landed in Coral Springs, did about 10 plus years in Coral Springs Police Department, excelled, as you mentioned, won numerous different medals and awards, pretty much anything that you can get in this profession. But I had a different vision. I thought there was more things I can do in the private sector for active shooter preparedness and response protocols and shift, retired out early. Of course, the tragedy in Parkland took place. I had a certain skill set and expertise, having helped shape Coral Springs policies and protocols, where I was appointed and then eventually elected. And part of the electoral process of what my campaign was for this community was that we were going to vacate the interests of politics that so dominated this office and get back to focusing on public safety. Now, one of the things that I had advantageous, believe it or not, most folks probably wouldn't see it that way, but I most certainly did, was the fact that I was coming into this office as an appointed sheriff and being the first African-American to have ever served in this role, and then later winning the election as the first. Well, throughout that process, that gave me something that most of my colleagues, I'm the 17th sheriff of this agency, the other 16 did not have, which was the perspective of what it's like to be a minority in this country, and a perspective about what it is to be a minority leader over this organization. Because if you look at the demographic breakdowns here in Broward County, we have roughly 650 something plus thousand people who identify as white or Caucasian. Then we have another 610 roughly thousand people that identify as Hispanic and Latino. And then another 500 plus thousand people that would fall in the category of African American or Black, and then all other remaining members of our population kind of following in there from Asian and Pacific America, things of that nature. But we're 1.9 million people in this county. Having understood what the majority perspective may be about policing and the complications that exist, that fraction of trusting the police, whether it be because of slavery, because of civil rights, all these things, I had knew it because I had lived it, I had understood it. My family members from generation had lived it and understood it. And it helped shape my process of what did I want to do as an administrator in this organization. Fundamentally, the first thing, of course, was to mitigate, fix the deficiencies that we had related to active shooter preparedness and response protocols. Many things that we had failed as an organization, systemically or institutionally, we could have done better. So I gravitated towards fixing that issue first. We enhanced our active shooter training, policies, protocol, invested millions of dollars in our threat management team, our real-time crime center, weapons platforms, breaking ground and building a $50 million training center, which is underway right behind me, and really starting to build the community trust there. But from a cultural standpoint, one of the things I had observed very early on, in fact, I would say day one, coming in and accepting command, the first thing I noticed was that there had been a past practice for every sheriff that came into the organization to bring in their administration, typically hiring friends, people that they work with in previous agencies or people that they had personal relationships with. And there's many stories from when one of my predecessors was here, Ron Cochran. They call it the bloodbath, where hundreds of people were terminated almost instantly when he came in. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to trust in the organization. I felt like an organization of almost 6,000 employees here should have enough talented individuals to help lead the organization. And I knew that to be true because as a SWAT operator, I had kicked a lot of doors and worked with a lot of BSO people, and I knew there were some fine deputies here. And so I promoted from within. That was a huge culture shock. Initially, I walked through the doors with a very small transition team. I had one of my advisors with me, who's a former chief of police in Coral Springs. And then I also had an undersheriff that came in with me, another member who's a colonel in the United States Marine Corps who had exceptional leadership skills. But after that, it was promoting from within. Now, fundamentally, the biggest part that we're going to talk about today is diversity and inclusion, but that was pivotal to get where we are now. I assessed and looked at the time, tenure, talent, and capability of the individuals in the organization and started to select individuals to put them in those executive department head positions, colonels. And so before you knew it, my undersheriff, first African-American female to serve in that capacity, my fire chief over the fire department, first Jamaican male to serve in that capacity. I have a colonel, female, Black woman over the Department of Detention. Her lieutenant colonel is a Black woman. And I can go on and on and on. If you go on our executive command page on our website, look, we look like the United Nations out there. We are a cross section from every single part of this community, and we are reflective of this community. Going back to those numbers that I gave you earlier, right? We're a minority majority community. 60+% of the people basically identify in some form of Hispanic or Black. Why is that important? Here's why. When I have my command staff meetings and we do the Knights of the Round Table approach and all my colonels are sitting at the table, it provides a different perspective and a different dialogue and conversation when we're shifting and shaping policies or putting forth activities to benefit this community, to serve this community. The conversation is different. It's not that a table of, let's say, 15 all white men are incompetent or not capable of leading this organization, but it makes it very difficult when all you can see around the table is one form, one culture, one creed, and then no one at the table that has a perspective as to why the kid walking down the street, the Black kid walking down the street with the hoodie, with the headsets on, feel like he's a target, right? I've said this publicly numerous times now. I've been the sheriff of this office for over 3 years, but I've been a Black man in America for 43 years. And so I understand what all these institutional things, the systemic things that bifurcate the relationship between the civilians and law enforcement. And then now I have a command staff that they too understand it, and it gives us to shift the things that are important. I'll give you one example. During the George Floyd atrocity, the murder, one of the calls for reform was about enhancing or instituting de-escalation techniques in training. Well, several years before I arrived, the county had introduced racial equity and implicit bias training for all their staffers. They invited the sheriff's office, having spoke to my predecessor about getting this organization involved in training the deputies in the same skill set to help reduce the tensions about racism and discrimination. It was rejected. Predecessor organization rejected it on the front end and never did anything with it. My perspective, my command staff perspective, when we're talking was, man, we really need to do this. My Cuban brothers, my Hispanic brothers, my members who happen to be gay or lesbian, was able to talk and say, yeah, inclusion, this type of training is a necessity. And so let's invest in it. That conversation apparently was held beforehand, but it was held beforehand amongst a group or individual that didn't understand the importance of including the community in the training, getting to a point where deputies and law enforcement officers have a true understanding that this exists, it's real, and that it didn't die down and disappear after the civil rights movement, and that it is now another extension for how we need to fight for and with our community about making sure everyone's treated justly and equally in this county and in this country. I'll share another example about why or how having more inclusion, having more diversity at the table serves beneficial in this organization and probably any other organization, whether it be in public safety or in private sector, it doesn't matter. Another conversation we had was about the importance of getting the community involved more with our community policing approach. And so we had to shift our concept of community policing to where we're a county of 31 cities. My responsibilities cover almost half of those, but each and every city is very unique, right? The issues in Weston are totally different than the issues in Pompano. The issues in Pompano are totally different than those that may be in, let's say, Deerfield. And so we had to shift and change how we were doing community policing and take this kind of customized model for each city. And what we saw was we started building a coalition of forces, so to speak. Every single one of our cities now have something called a neighborhood support team. And that team goes out and build, they grab 5 pastors, they get 5 business owners, they get 5 students or teachers involved. And so now we have a dialogue about what's important for those cities and how we need to invest their money, because it's not my money, invest their money back into those cities, therefore into the county. Tremendous opportunity. I will also share another important thing is that I've been able to do with inclusion is, as the sheriff, selecting those individuals who are qualified, competent, morally, ethically sound to do the job and put them in a position. And it happened to work out that we're reflective of the county. However, one of the things I heard from the community is that we don't have enough front-facing law enforcement officials that look like them. What do I mean? Patrol capacity. Our patrol division is the tip of the spear for the entire organization. It's the first thing you see and the last thing you see related to BSO every single day. Whether you be in the traffic stop, whether you're driving down, you see officers, you see our front-facing patrol division. And so we had to assess, okay, how do we go about making this organization attractive once again to the minority community post George Floyd and post or during COVID-19? So we changed our recruitment tactics. We went out, we start looking at our historical Black universities and colleges to help recruit and bring folks in. We went back into the community and start really tapping down on that viable asset that you get by hiring a kid that grew up in Pompano, because he or she will know that community better. They already have the credibility because they grew up in the community. Then they have the know-how and knowledge about the geographical areas, the environments, the street names, all these things, which is advantageous for the organization and the community that they're serving. So we changed our recruitment tactics to make it more attractive to bring people in. We went to the military bases. We start looking at old applicants. This is another thing. We start looking at old applicants that may have not gotten through the process, but when we ran a comparison as to whether or not they were Black or whether or not they were white, what we started to see was that perhaps a candidate that may have been a white male who had some indiscretion as a young teenager, 16, 17 years old, maybe he had some involvement with marijuana, he would be given the grace to continue on in the process and then get hired. But then we looked at those of Hispanic or African-American descent where they didn't get the same opportunities. To me, I saw bias there. And I said, wait a minute, if we're going to be fair and impartial, what we do for one class of our community, we have to do for the other. And so that afforded us an opportunity to bring in more recruits and get them in. Another component that we introduced was taking the talent from within and giving them an opportunity to become law enforcement. So I mentioned the size and scale of the organization, almost 6,000 employees, a significant portion of the people that we have in our employee base work in the Department of Detention. That is our jail system, our structure for maintaining the care, custody, and control of our inmate population here in Broward County. Well, something that came up while I started looking at audits and evaluating who our personnel was that we had a good portion, almost 300 of our deputies, detention deputies, were cross-certified to be law enforcement officers. So what does that mean? At some point, they had an interest to go from the Department of Detention into law enforcement. But that bank of 300 plus different deputies predominantly was African-American or Hispanic that was on that list. They weren't being tapped into. So that didn't make any sense to me. So we increased an internal recruitment initiative to say, hey, listen, all you detention deputies out there who are cross-certified, and I know you wanted to be law enforcement 7 years, 8 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, and you never had the opportunity. Well, the opportunity exists now. And so let's get you over, let's get you in this capacity, let's get you out on the road, because that it serves so many different beneficial sides, right? So let's think about this. I have a detention deputy who's dealing with the worst of society on a daily basis. They don't have a gun, they don't have batons, it's just communication skills. Our detention deputies do a phenomenal job at communicating with the worst of society on a daily basis, and they don't have any guns or any of the cool, I call Batman equipment on their belt. Now, taking that skill set that they've been able to develop over their time and tenure in Department of Detention and shifting that over into law enforcement, I think one could surmise that they're going to do a very good job at communicating with the public, which is more than likely going to reduce tensions and everything else. I think another thing that that's been advantageous for me is I've always been academically sound about being engaged. I've been teaching for over a decade, actually. And I'm still in school. I'm finishing up my PhD. So I read, I do a lot of research, and I start analyzing things that we're doing, as well as the things that other communities are doing. So I think collectively, if you look at how we've done recruitment, if you looked at the things we've invested in within our command structure, making sure that we have policies and protocols in place that truly bring forth a balancing act of accountability. We introduced a use of force review board, which now measures all different types of use of force elements that we have, so that we're not waiting for something to come on CNN. We created a social justice task force, which incorporates community leaders and stakeholders to help us shape policies and inform the community about the truths and facts that are occurring in the organization. We've reset the tone and tempo for what the expectation is for accountability. There's no more abuse or slap on the wrist for excessive force. You will be terminated. I mean, I don't sugarcoat that. But overall, I think we've set the path forward about the great things that we can do here as an organization if we are more receptive to and tolerant of allowing every part of this community to serve in leadership capacity and part of this organization. So I went a little bit longer, but with that, I think it'd be easier if I turn it over and maybe we take some questions.
Absolutely. So I'll ask some questions, but for those who would like to ask the sheriff some questions, please feel free to type them in the chat and your question will be acknowledged. First of all, phenomenal job, Sheriff Tony. Thank you so much again for spending time with us and sharing that powerful message. I guess here's where I'll start. Prior to me being Associate Dean of the Criminal Justice area, I was an African-American history professor and American history professor, and still teach a class at nights, right? And so one of the things I think about is historically in this country, when we look at racism, a lot of it is rooted in an assumption that people of color are intellectually inferior, right? You hear people suggest, well, the reason why people of color don't have leadership opportunities is not because of bias, but rather it's because of a limited talent pool. Maybe they don't have the proper training, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, that's nonsense, but that exists, right? And so what do you say to people who have that notion, that thought that it's not due to bias, there's just a lack of people of color that warrant the title of leadership? How do you respond to that?
Well, I've had to respond to that numerous times, since I've been in office. I still travel. I just came back from the FBI National Executive Institute, and we had a dialogue about this in those areas. And first, I would say that it's important for people to understand American history and all of America's history, and not the isolated versions of it that we've seen in our history books that shade and hide and get away from the true atrocities that occurred during the slave trade and how that rode into Jim Crow, Black codes, and civil rights, and all these different elements. It has always been a part of the campaign from early on slavery to, if you're going to create a human atrocity, the first thing you have to do is devalue the human nature of the people that you're going to take that right away from. And so there had been a campaign behind stereotypes that we were inferior, that we were monsters, that we were savages. And that made it very easy, even for our good brothers who happen to be white, to say, well, perhaps we shouldn't get involved because we heard X. Now, that's a deep dive back into history, but that type of campaigning, deliberate campaigning for stereotypes, has penetrated decade after decade and decade. Maybe not to be as egregious as what we've seen, right? The blackface and the lips and all that type of stuff, but it's still been characterized in some of the stereotypes today. It's also part of what's front-facing in front of us often. There's a faster pace, social media pace. Everything's hip hop, everything's one single category, that we don't really exercise and display the significant work that many people of color are doing and their contributions in every part of this country, not just law enforcement, but from scientists to NASA to the military to private sector, to corporate worlds, all these things. It's not front facing as I would like to see it, because I think that would penetrate through some of the stereotypes and make it more acceptable to give people a fair chance to succeed. I'll go back to myself, personal reflection. When I first came into the organization, no one knew my name as a political candidate, so to speak. I was an outsider, so to speak, coming in, although I had been in Broward County since 2005. And I had penetrated through this political machine here in Broward County and focused on just performing, doing my job, doing the policies, doing the enhanced training, doing all the things that the people expected. And in turn, what happened? The community responded. The community didn't say, hey, this is some young Black guy in here that, we don't know if he's capable. We don't know if he's intelligent. They said, no, look what he's doing. Ran a campaign off performance and won the election based on performance. No political favors. Didn't get any endorsements. Wasn't looking for any endorsements. And to me, I said, the only endorsement that matters is the endorsement of the people. If I do my job, they'll keep me here. And it worked. But had I not had a chance to be in front of the microphone, in front of the camera, and display what I was capable of doing, I wouldn't be in the seat.
A great answer. Again, folks, if you would like to ask the sheriff a question, feel free to type a question in the box. And while hopefully some folks are doing that, I have some more questions for you. So you come in and you are appointed. You are not elected, and eventually you do get elected. You talked about getting buy-in from the community, which is evidenced by you being elected. Mm-hmm. How did you get buy-in from your organization, right? I mean, I could imagine for some of them, the thought is, who is this new guy? He wants to diversify, our workforce and our leadership as well. How did you get buy-in from your team?
Yeah, so first of which, it was a tremendous transition in culture. I can recall the first day in office, after in front of the podium, I said, I'm going to look for talented individuals within before I bring anyone from the outside. And I call up a command staff meeting. And these are career law enforcement officials who 20 plus years and 15 years, et cetera, accomplished individuals. But they were all nervous. I mean, literally, I was watching people shaking hands and they were trembling. They gave me my keys to the office. They're trembling because the expectation was, here comes, the guillotine. He is going to start taking heads and firing people and bring in his own squadron of people. When I didn't do that, that was the instant, well, let's give him a chance. He didn't come in like the other 16 sheriffs or so. Let's give him a chance. So that was a quick earned, you have to evaluate the man on what he's going to do. Then I stuck with it. I start promoting people qualified, competent, morally and ethically sound. As much as we are diverse, I could care less about hiring or promoting somebody who's Black or Hispanic if they can't do this job. They won't get promoted here if they're incompetent. There have been some African-American individuals here and people of color who were under the expectation that they would just get promoted, but they weren't qualified or competent to do the job. It benefits no organization to promote people of color that are not competent, because when they fail, heavy is the head of he who wears the crown. No one's going to say, oh, well, that major didn't do his job. No, the sheriff didn't do his job. And so when I make my selections about who's going to be promoted, those are the front-facing things for me. Are they qualified, competent, morally and ethically sound to do the job? If I can check off those boxes, then the second element I look at it is, okay, who is the person? Is there a benefit? Is this a woman, right? One of the things I didn't elaborate too much on, but out of almost 400 or 500 plus different promotions that's been made internally, almost half of them been women. So women are getting their fair shake at being in this organization and leading, and we are excelling. So buy-in was proof of concept. Do the things you said you were going to do. Secondly, making sure that you have ambassadors that can speak to what changes you are making to disseminate it down into the troops, right? If I have a captain, captains typically are district commanders, right? A captain leading up Deerfield, and he or she does not buy into the message that I'm disseminating down about inclusion, about opportunities, about promotion, about all these different things, and they cut that off, then the message is lost. So it was important to, one, establish what your message is, what the conversation is going to be like, and that then the consistency amongst all your administrators are the same. This can't be one of those conversations, Rudy, where I whisper in your ear, you whisper in somebody else's ear, and by the time you get down to the 15th person, it's totally different. No, it has to be the same. My troops in the field need to be able to hear my message without any, diluted version of it, because then you disconnect the organization.
Well said. We have a question from the chat, and it says this. Good morning, Sheriff. Coming from a person that wants to start her criminal justice career soon, is it best to start off as a detention deputy? And the second question is, are there any jobs within BSO that requires a CDL license?
I'll start with the first part of the question. And I think if you're getting involved in an organization, you go Department of Detention, it's only going to benefit you. But I also wouldn't say that it's a mandate. That wouldn't be fair. If you decide you want to go straight into law enforcement, come on in. But I will share a personal experience that I had, understanding what it's like. One of the first or early on jobs I had fresh out of college, I was working at the Department of Corrections. I was at Wakulla Correctional Institute while I was in grad school, and I was teaching adult basic literacy and pre-GED material to like level 6 inmate. I had killers and sexual predators, you name it, they were in my class. Well, walking into that classroom environment as a civilian, I most certainly didn't have the bat belt with the gun and the equipment. So I had to learn how to communicate with these individuals, even when some days they came in pissed off, some days they came in looking for conflict, but I had to learn how to manage my emotions and learn how to manage what was going on with them and communicating with them. When I walked out of there and landed in law enforcement, I had always had a confidence level and knowing how to communicate, knowing, okay, this guy's, he's venting, he's pissed off. He's not really mad at me. He's mad at every other experience he had in law enforcement. He's mad at government because he lost his job, all these variables. So I think it's beneficial. As far as CDL, it depends on what type of vehicles that you're operating for the organizations. We have an enormous fleet here, from patrol vehicles to shipping vehicles. So I would say, depending on what you're doing, yes, you may be required to have one.
Great. And again, anyone else can ask questions if they so choose with a few minutes we have left. Let me ask you this. It's one thing to have an objective and to deploy strategy, but there's something about the courage it took to say, I'm going to be in this leadership role, and so I'm going to do what is right, right?
That's right.
Speak about where you got that courage from to do what is right, to diversify your staff, and to kind of change course in a positive direction.
Man, I have to say, I think over time, I think, coming out of the environment I came out of, going through all the difficulties, being a long-term athlete and understanding leadership roles as captains on a team, and which I had been on just about every team from football, baseball, wrestling, you name it. You start understanding that there's going to be times in these leadership roles where you're going to have to make a decision that goes against the grain or culture or tradition of previous practices. But those things were executed by different people. And so you have to measure out, who are you as an individual, as a man or a woman? Where's your compass? What are the moral things you believe in? And how do you integrate that into your leadership capacity when you're managing almost 6,000 people? And you can't be flexible with your own moral compass. It's non-negotiable. I can negotiate on a lot of different things, but when it comes to my moral compass, my character, what I believe in to know is right and wrong, we won't even sit at the table. There's no discussion about it. And I've had those challenges where I had to really even go against the grain of some of my experienced veterans who are making recommendations, but their recommendations are driven behind previous practices and cultures versus what we are dealing with right now and who's the individual that you are sitting in front of. And that took time. It took time for my administration my colonels, my majors to understand what the expectation is out of the sheriff. One of the things that is very uniquely different amongst the sheriff position and the chief of police positions that exist throughout the United States is typically a chief of police can be removed from his seat either by an individual manager or by a vote of the majority, 3 people, and then they're fired and they're gone, right? As the sheriff of this organization, the people vote me in this office to do their job. My name isn't on the door. On my door, it says the people's office. I refuse to put my name on it, right? This office belongs to the people. So I am doing the work for them. If the majority wants me to be removed, hundreds of thousands of people will vote, and then they will make sure I'm on my way out of here. So the pressures are different, but also I'm gonna leave you with this. I played for Coach Bobby Bowden, who's a great man we lost last year. And one of the things he had mentioned to me when he heard my story and he knew what I had been through, he mentioned that only the hottest fires make for the strongest steel. And I had been through so much that it had built me up to be able to make tough choices here. And I didn't see it as I was going through it, right? When you're a young man and you're battling, it says, why me? I didn't see it. But everything that I had endured, every challenge I had to face, every hurdle I had to jump has afforded me the strength to do what's right for this community.
That's a great quote. And I'm a Hurricanes fan, but I got to give it to Bobby Bowden. That's a great quote. Someone asked this. I'll just 2 more questions. One question, and then I have a final question I'd like to ask.
Sure.
Someone asked this: do all deputies receive implicit bias training? And how do you and supervisors ensure that these trainings are effective?
Yeah, so first, yes, to that part, we've instituted, it's a mandatory training element that we've done. Second, I've invested about $200,000, I think, or so, at least I allocated towards it, for a tracking system and mechanism called Power DMS. Power DMS is a software system that shows when a person took the exam, when they took the course, when they took the training. So we track it to make sure we stay on top of it so that every single employee has an opportunity to get it. Now, one thing I'm proud to say is we started this with law enforcement, right? Because that was the tip of the spear. George Floyd, it's front facing. Again, I always use the front facing side. That's what you're seeing. So we shifted there. But then I talked to my fire chief, knowing that we have almost 800 people in our fire services. Fire rescue will be taking the training. And the goal really is just to integrate it across every single part of the agency, because the reality of it is it's an educational tool that we all need to really understand our country a little bit better. Real quick, I had a young deputy having a conversation with her about 2 years ago. I'll never forget this, in early 20s. And we're talking about all the stuff going on and the importance of holding people accountable and inclusion. And I brought up Jim Crow. And she didn't really know what Jim Crow was. And I said, okay, there's a failure there in our educational system at some level, that a adult in her 20s is not aware of what Jim Crow is. And people are like, well, it didn't affect her, she's white. No, it affected this whole country. There are things we are dealing with now because of Jim Crow. And if you don't understand that, when you're talking to a 70-year-old or 65-year-old Black male or Black woman, when you go into their house and they're referencing something about Jim Crow, then you don't understand that you're in an environment where there is some serious racial tension going on. And how are you going to de-escalate it if you can't recognize it? Just a little story.
Right. So how do you, to kind of that second part of the question is, how do you assess if it's being effective, right? People can kind of use it as a check mark, right, but is there a way to assess, like, yeah, it's making a difference in our officers?
Well, so again, one thing that's beneficial for me is, like, I'm in the research world. And one of the things I want to do is to be able to pull and look at, kind of do an independent research analysis of, are we reducing more conflicts with minorities since the training? Are we reducing use of force cases since the training? But with a study like that, it's going to take several years for us to put it in play and measure it effectively to see, hey, it was worth the investment. But what I will tell you is, internally, this is kind of the first indicator. When I talk to the cross section of members who were in this classroom, and not just BSO employees, because I pay for training for all police officers in the county, right? So we had people from every organization who came out and was like, man, that was actually good training. If I can continue to have that message echoed, then I know at least it's going to go back into their agencies, stay within our agencies, and people are going to be a proponent of it versus I don't want to talk about race, right? Can't be afraid of it. We got to tackle this.
Last question for you. You bring up a good point about research, right? You can have short-term data points, but that data can switch over time, right? So a lot of these things, it's really a matter of long-term data points and seeing the sustainability of this. What are some of the indications to you that people of color, as far as those who are civilians, are feeling the difference in BSO, or is that going to take some more time to kind of get a sense of how folks are feeling?
No, so again, I jumped out ahead of this thing. So we just had a comprehensive polling study done about whether or not the community here in Broward County was, in agreement with what we have done. And so we put out these kind of Sheriff Tony or BSO initiatives highlighting all the major things we've done, from racial equity, implicit bias training, to all the reform elements that we put in place, the use of force review board, threat management, everything. And across all 9 districts, we were favorable anywhere between 75 as high up to 83% positivity approval rating when people knew about the projects that we were done. Again, we've never done that in this agency, but I come from a different approach. I said, we're putting in all these new programs and policies, but how are we measuring it? And so we sent out and had an independent study done. We took a large sample size of over 1,000+ people. It covered all the different demographics that are representative in the agency, in the county, to include their political demographics, right? Republican, Democrat, Independent, and just really measure this out. And we were excited. I got to tell you, I sat with my command staff, and when the numbers start popping up, we was like, wow, okay, great. Now, what does that do also as an administrator? For those people who are looking to get here or above here, it also gives you an opportunity, because I have to step in front of a county commission and articulate why I need $1 billion every year. It gives me a chance to say, look, this is what the community wants. And every single district, they have approved and recommended for ongoing training in the area of racial equity, implicit bias training. So this shouldn't be something I have to shift and move funding for in my budget. Instead, it's going to be a line item in my budget, right? So it changes how we're going to do business. It changes, we're not wasting money. I don't want to waste money on projects that don't work. You got to be able to measure it and know it's beneficial.
This has been great. Sheriff Tony, we truly appreciate you on behalf of the Criminal Justice Department at Broward College, as well as the ACADI, the Advisory Council for the Advancement of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. It's amazing. Dr. Mura says in the chat, thank you so much, Sheriff Tony. My class is now geared up for a discussion next week to consider what equity and inclusion in their potential fields looks like. So thank you for inspiring us, Sheriff Tony, and making a difference in our community. We really, truly appreciate it. Thank you so much. Any final words that you would like to share?
Sure. No, thanks again for allowing me to come on and speak to the audience. I'm always available for students. They're the future of our nation here. Just on a personal note, a long time ago, and I've heard this at least asked me a couple of times, what it's like to make history. And, I've never set out to make history. And I would encourage you all not to do that. Set out to do your very best. Set out to do your very best in whatever skill set, task that may come in front of you. Do your very best. And if you're doing your very best, if that's the focal point all the time, then perhaps at some point you'll become part of history. So thank you all. If there's any follow-up that you want, you can always send my staff an email. If you're looking to dive more deeper in the projects that we introduce, you can go on sheriff.org/Sheriff Tony Initiatives. And we have videos, we have content about all the different projects that we launched. And look, study hard and don't let anybody tell you what you can and cannot do. Thanks.
Thank you, Sheriff Tony. Everyone, take care. Have a wonderful day. And we really appreciate you attending this wonderful talk.